Welcome back to another episode of the Meaningful People Podcast, Season 3. We're glad you are here.
And this episode has been the longest wait that we've done for any episode, right? We filmed this
a year ago.
Yeah, a little less, but okay. So I've been waiting to say the story. We got in touch with Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twerski, Olav Shalom, and he was ready to do the episode with us, and it was the height of COVID, or maybe right after the height of COVID, and he didn't want anyone coming into his home. He's there with his wife, and I don't know, they're very elderly and being very cautious. Fine. So the only way we could have done the episode was through Zoom, which we were ready to do. The problem is Rabbi Twerski had a bit of a hearing loss, so he needed to wear headphones while we did it. The problem was he wasn't so tech savvy. He was super mental health savvy, but when it came to tech, he wasn't as savvy as maybe Nachum and myself, but he was actually pretty savvy for someone his age. Either way, we were on the phone with him, kind of trying to direct him through the process of putting the Zoom on. And we even got our editor Sruly on the phone as well. And I was talking to him, and he couldn't hear me. And his wife wasn't sure where the plug was, where we could put in headphones. And at the end of the day, as you probably could realize, we couldn't do the episode with him. And
we wanted to, but it wasn't happening at that moment. So we were gonna have someone go there and help out
in a hazmat suit. But long story short, shortly after, unfortunately, I think he got COVID, or either way, he passed away. And it was like, I don't know, like 2 weeks before, maybe 3 weeks before. And it's so ironic for me that the person who talks about being anxious and worrying, like I was on the phone with him and I was getting so like, oh, we're so close, like how can we do that? And like it just wasn't meant to be. But if there's one thing I could say, we got to talk to Rabbi Twerski, and although he couldn't really hear us so well, there was still that soothing tone of him of like kind of giving over this, like, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. Like, he didn't say that, but like within his tone, that's what it was. And after, I'm like, I should be bugging out more after that exact, trying to record didn't work out. And like, I wasn't. And I'm like, okay, it is what it is. And like, that's something that he's given over to the world. And, we didn't sit down with him, but we got to sit down with, why didn't you say who we sat down with?
We sit down with his
children. His grandson and granddaughter.
And we were able to speak to them about their life with their Zaidi.
Yeah.
And it's really, they really grew up with him.
Yes.
And Dr. Abraham, Rabbi.
Like Rabbi, Doctor, he's like everything. He's probably a lawyer also.
He is, he's a really, really an impactful fellow, someone who had such a strong influence on Klal Yisrael, more than you probably even know. You may not know who he was if you're on the younger side, and if you're on the older side, you definitely know who he was. Mm-hmm. Either way, by listening to this episode, which sort of coincides with his yard site, I think you'll get to know him a lot better, and we wanted to sort of make a tribute episode. So here it is.
And hold on, just going to add in one more thing. There's also, we speak to his grandchildren. Also, his grandson thought it would be very important that we have a recovering addict that Rabbi Dr. Twerski probably helped hundreds of thousands of people, but we could only have one of them. But we had one of them to talk about, the impact that he made on his life. And we shot this, I don't know, less than a month, maybe like 2 weeks after he passed away. So this is a conversation from, right after he passed away. So, yeah.
Enjoy.
Welcome to the Meaningful People Podcast, the podcast where we talk to people who are
meaningful.
Yeah, that sounds good. I see it less as like a biography, because I'm sure there will be better biographies about him coming out. But it's honestly whatever you feel interesting that will give people chizuk, that could personify who your Zayda was.
Yeah, talk. So I'll tell you, I think in one sentence, one of the things that most personifies my Zayda is, I think, today we have so many books and so many svarim about different gedolim, and every gadol hadar was, he was an ailyah when he was little, and he was, a tzaddik, and he did this and he did that and he did the other thing, and he was perfect for his whole life, and he was, a real kadosh elyon and all those things, and which happens to be that my grandfather was all of them, but I think he was more than that. And the more than that he was, I think what personifies him most was that he was a human being, and he wasn't scared to speak about his shortcomings, and he wasn't scared to have shortcomings, and he worked on them. I think that just in general, that a lot of people can really emphasize and put the emphasis in their life on Kedusha, which he did. And he really was a kadosh, but I think one of the most amazing things was his Avas Yisrael and his complete, I guess would be, it wasn't really fear, but it just wasn't even an option that anybody would ever be hurt or insulted or compromised in any way because of him. And this was just this was just his entire life. And I grew up in his house. I wasn't an easy child, considering the fact that he started raising a second set of children at 51 when he was, supposed to be enjoying his grandchildren. And then he started raising us. He was never angry. He never, ever got angry.
You never saw him angry?
Ever. Never.
I'll tell you something interesting. He told me, I wonder if you ever spoke about this with the guys. I don't know. I was sitting with him. This is when he was living in Muncie. He's sitting with me on the couch, and he says to me, Chaim, kas, anger, and covet, the one for honor. He said, I've totally eradicated that. I've worked on that already. He said to one of my cousins around the same time, he said, Taiva, he said, that I'm still working on. I still like a good bowl of ice cream. That's what he told me.
Those were his Taivas.
And yeah, that was his extent basically of his Taivas. But he actually told me, he may have written this in his books, that there's a Yerushalmi that says one of the questions adds on to the regular questions they're going to ask a person when they come up to Shemayim, besides for whether you're Kavayit and Latayra and were you honest in business, is if you enjoyed my world. neshama ailyah. Isaiah said, the other questions, everybody, I don't know if you can answer. When the Eibishter is going to ask me if I enjoyed his world, he said to me, did I enjoy your world, God? He said that I will be able to answer with a clean conscience. But he told me then, and I agree, I also never saw him angry. I never saw him raise his voice. He told me when he eradicated that, he told me a short little thing that happened to him. It's an experience, and it's just an eye-opener how somebody works on themselves from when they're younger to they're older. He said he was in South Africa for a speech, and he was the guest speaker, right? He came into South Africa with his wife, with Rabbi, and he said there were over 1,000 people in attendance. They were scalping tickets outside because they had sold out all the tickets. He said, and as he walks into the room, over 1,000 people stand up for him. And he told me he's thinking to himself, you guys know who you're standing up for? He said he was like nauseous. He was sick to his stomach. Like, why are you standing up for me? And he told me it meant nothing to me. And he said, it's a shame. He said this like his classic smile, this twinkle in his eye. He said, it's a shame this didn't happen when I was younger, because when I was 40, I probably would have enjoyed it. And the beauty of the story is that we're human beings. We have midas. When we're 10, we're one way. When we're 20, we're another way. 30, 40, 50, 60, all the way up till 90. God does not expect us at 40 to be 90, and so on. And he worked on himself. So by the time he was in his 70s and this happened, no, he didn't need those 1,000 people to stand up for him. It meant nothing to him. So there's still hope, guys.
So
Pittsburgh was also a very magical place. For me, it was a very magical place because when I met, I know him like a lot of different ways. I know him as Abe. I know him as Dr. Twerski. I know him as Rabbi Twerski. Before I met him, I thought that, that the family that came from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that's children went to law school and to med school, right? Because to this, this made an impression on me, and at one point in time, I was known as one of Abe's babes, because if you went through Gateway, you automatically got a designation and a pin, right, with his picture on it. And when I walked out, he said, you don't have nothing to worry about, he says. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, you got to, do what you got to do for your disease, right? Because alcoholism and addiction is a disease. You have to take care of your disease. And by that, he meant go to 12-step meetings and get a sponsor and work the steps. And he said, and, you have to go to meetings, you have to talk to your sponsor, and you have to change your whole life, right? You have to change your whole life.
But you got nothing to worry about.
I don't know about you, but at 30 years old, I was, not enamored with changing my whole life, right? But that's exactly what happened, because I followed his direction. And he told me, he said that if you stay in Pittsburgh, I'll help you along. And he was true to his word. I mean, it's 35 years later. I still have a relationship with the man, and with his family. And I have the most amazing relationship with Hashem, which is much different. And that's a long process and a long journey that we all take in life, whether we like it or not. We all take it in life, because if Hashem is not happy with who you are, he bounces something that's critical in your life, right? And you get a growth spurt because you really see him, right? And if you really see him, there's nothing like it.
Is that something Rabbi Dr. Twerski Alav Shalom helped out with? I mean, besides for really addressing the alcoholism and the addiction.
Well, take a look at all his books.
I mean,
right?
which one
there's like 90 books now.
I was speaking to Rabbi Dr.
Which one of his? Take out any of his books. He always said that he wrote 90 books, but he wrote one book, right? And he wrote it 90 different ways.
I was speaking.
But you know what? He was always more of an unuv, right?
Yeah.
The biggest factor for me, right, was I was able to hang out with a person that was a walking Kiddush Hashem. You understand? He wasn't saving Jewish lives at that point in time. You understand? He was saving, the people that he came by that were Jewish. But most of the people that he came by were Gentile people, right? And on the cover of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, on the magazine section, like you guys have the magazine. In the old days, the magazine section of the New York Times used to be this thick, right? Today it's like a little thin, and when it used to be that thick, they put his picture on the cover of the magazine section, stating that this hasidic rabbi has changed the lives of 20,000 goyim. You understand?
What do you think his approach, I mean, different than any other rabbi or psychologist in history, what do you think his approach, changed the game so much? What was it about him and his approach?
I'll tell you what I feel his approach was, and Judah, you can either second it or add whatever you think. And I have some stories to back it up. I think that he truly, first of all, I think he had an unbelievable amount of emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I think that it manifested itself in many different ways. But one of its prime manifestations was in his faith in humanity and his love of people. And he loved people just because they were Tzelem Elokim, whether they were Jewish, not Jewish, white, black, neshama, nefesh. It made no difference to him. It was a human being, and they were worthy of his love and respect because of that. And because of that, he was also one of the most approachable people in the world. Anybody could talk to him. Little kids loved to talk to him. Anybody was able to walk up and talk to him. He was never the kind of person who gave you the feeling of being a snob in any way. And his his trust in people. I was just talking before we got on, I was reminding Judah that when we were little, so we were growing up in my grandparents' house. My mother was in nursing school full time, or she was a nurse and was working 10-hour shifts and 12-hour shifts 5 times a week. Sometimes it was night, sometimes it was not. And my grandparents were sometimes available to help out most of the time, but very often they were not. And our babysitters were, believe it or not, recovering addicts, not recovered addicts. They were recovering in the halfway house.
We called, there was a whole group of religious Jews that came to Pittsburgh for recovery. They weren't,
which changed throughout the years.
They weren't the main staple of his center. His center had hundreds of people at a time. I don't know, but there were always these group of guys. I've seen a bunch of people saying they called them Shiites because my grandfather's name was Rabbi Yeshua Heschel and his nickname in the family was Shia. So in Pittsburgh, he was also known as Shia, so they called them Shiites. We called them the gang. Okay, that's how we called them as children. We grew up with these guys around, and they would come over for Shabbos, and we saw them in shul, and they would come to my grandfather's shiurim and talks. We were little kids, and we called them the gang. We went strawberry picking with them. We went to games with them. There was one of them would have me over in his house every Sunday. He would babysit for me in his house.
When my mother didn't have a babysitter for her night shift, so we'd sleep over their houses. And I asked my grandfather about 5 years ago, I said, I'm a mother of kids. I would never leave my children with recovering addicts. Right. What were you thinking? But I have to tell you that the best experiences of our childhood, honestly, were with them, and we're closer to them still today. We're in touch with right? We're in touch with them, and it's a feeling of family. Like we talk to them like I would speak to my brothers and my cousins. It's the same kind of, and I really feel that it's a reflection of his faith in humanity and his faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he created everything good. And I really think that was one of his secrets to being able to help so many people recover, because no matter what they were, he saw in front of him a diamond. And there's a story with a girl who came, there was a story with a girl who came to him, and she'd been in Gateway a few times, and she kept coming back for rehab. And at some point he said to her, why are you putting all this, how much do you hate yourself? Why are you putting all this garbage into your body? Why are you doing this to yourself? And he started giving her examples. Would you poison yourself? Would you do this? Would you do that? And she's like, no. And finally he's like, then why are you doing this? And I really believe that he truly saw each and every one of the people that sat before him as the only purpose in his life at that moment. There was no one else. When you were talking to him, it was only you. There wasn't a phone. There wasn't a cell phone. There wasn't a newspaper. There was nobody else. It was just you. And I think that his patients and people that he spoke to and people that he helped, they strongly felt that, because no person doesn't have to pretend. It just happens naturally. And if you really feel that way about people and you really love them, then they're going to feel that and they're going to respond to that.
I just want to add in one short thing. My grandfather learned Chassidus and Musar every day. It's interesting. It's famous when he went to college. He asked the Stipler before he went if he can go, and the Stipler made 5 conditions with him of what he would do while he's in university, so that the outside world shouldn't change him. He should learn what he has to and be able to remain the God-fearing Jew that he was. And one of the conditions he told him was he needs to learn Chassidus and Musar for 15 minutes a day while he's in college. My grandfather ended up doing much more than that his entire life. 9 years ago, he told one of my cousins he'd been through Mesilas Yesharim over 250 times.
Wow. He
started off every morning with Kedushas Levi and Mar-Naim that I saw myself. And there's a famous Mar-Naim. I'm not going to bore anybody with what the whole Vart, but the Mar-Naim clearly speaks about in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, that good and true tzaddikim only see good in other people. They don't see the bad, and even if they do, they don't focus on it. They love the good. The same way we love ourselves and we love the good that's in ourselves, even if we have other parts. My grandfather saw the good in everybody. He saw the good in me. I wasn't the best kid out there. I never felt from him. I never felt from him. We lived in awe of him. We were afraid to disappoint him because we knew he was a great man. But he never had, he was like, he could talk to me about anything and everything from when I was a little kid up till now, up till a couple of weeks ago. And if I disagreed with him, I was able to tell them, I would say it in Bakav de Gouay, he had no problem. He would explain himself to me.
Or
Sometimes he would tell me, you're right, or he'd just be quiet, but he was amazing.
So for a man that had all these qualifications, right? First of all, hardly any of us go through med school, right? Hardly any of us are composers of music. He had tremendous, he blew a shofar, like nobody blows a shofar. He davened for the Amid, like nobody davened for the Amid. Being at his table on Shabbos was eating chulent and kugel that sat on the blech all night was the most incredible experience. It was the most incredible experience. But all these things, right? You would think that it would be highly unapproachable to speak to a person who had all these, who was, and he was just the opposite. His anivus was just the opposite. And when Ruchie and Chaim were talking about who he trusted in his life to take care of him, when they were little, they had a pediatrician, right?
Oh, that's right.
They had a pediatrician that was in the program. When the Rebbe got sick, he didn't go to see, right? He used to go to her. He would go to people who were in the program, right? Because he knew that they were working on themselves. He knew that they weren't getting drunk, somewhere and not be able to take care of him.
He knew that they were good, honest people.
Right. And, when you're down and out, right? When you're down and out and somebody says, come with me, right? And he holds your hand as you're walking down the street, right? And he's showing the entire world, right? You think, when you're down and out, you don't think that you have any value at all. And this man always thought that you had value and was always lending his value to you so that you should be able to be lifted up. It was one of the most incredible experiences that a person could have.
Ruchie, as you said, and you pointed out about him having the recovering addicts babysitting, and what you just mentioned, that he went to the recovering addicts for help. I can imagine that places a ton of trust and confidence in them as recovering addicts. It probably makes them look at themselves as regular functioning people of society, and maybe that's
Definitely.
why he impacted and changed so many lives.
Definitely, I believe that.
I'll tell you a story I never really, it's occurring to me now that maybe it's important. When I turned 3, okay, my grandfather took me to shul in the morning, wrapped in his towels. He brought me to his minyan, and he took out the olive base chart. I have a picture of it, and he put honey on the letters, Aleph, Mem, and Saf, Emes, right? And he had me lick the honey. We had this cake, the whole thing. And when he was done, so they were taking me home. And I remember having a piece of chocolate cake with green icing on it. It was in my hand. I'm 3 years old, right? And he wants to wrap me in the towels. And my grandmother, Shalom, said, no, you can't wrap him in the towels. He's going to get dirty. I said, Bobby, I don't want to let go of my cake. So she said, you know what? If you don't eat from it at all, the whole ride home, so you won't get say this towel is dirty, we can wrap you in the towels. And of course, I said, I'm not going to eat from it. And of course, which 3-year-old for 10 minutes isn't going to? My grandfather,
and of course, the towels got dirty.
Yeah, he trusted me, and he wrapped me in that towels. It was occurring to me now when I've been thinking over the last couple of days, the amount of trust he put in a 3-year-old that he knew very fast not going. Man, did I smear up that towels, okay? It was green icing and chocolate icing, just that one little lick, which is also a lesson in life. That sometimes, you think you can be one way and you think you do one little move, it's going to ruin everything. He trusted that 3-year-old kid.
More important is that he didn't expect anybody to be perfect. I don't know if you grew up in the same yeshiva world that I grew up in. Hopefully they're doing a much better job now than they did when
Good
when
try.
different times. But I had to be perfect. I was taught 613 commandments and all the halachas, right? That I had to do them perfectly. That's a tremendous That's a tremendous yoke that was on my shoulders. And I didn't have to do them perfectly. But I'll tell you one thing, if you ever try to cut one out, he would never allow, if you went to ask him a shayla that you wanted to stop doing something, that was part of halacha, you would never get a yes answer. You could try to manipulate him all you want, and ask the question 100 different ways, but he would never allow you to do that. But if you didn't do it perfectly, that's, you didn't do it perfectly.
It takes a certain brilliance to give that over. That no, you don't need to be perfect, but at the same time, you have to follow what you have to follow.
Right.
I was suspended. I was suspended in high school. And I remember coming home and my grandfather said to me before I went back to school, he said something similar to you.
Why do you get suspended?
But he said to me, he said,
you don't want to know.
Okay.
well, why I was suspended from high school? We're not getting into that.
Okay, sorry.
I can tell you why I was
We're
suspended.
actually having your principal just joined the Zoom. 1 second.
No, she's not alive anymore. It's
Oh,
okay.
then that would be even
She was
weirder.
actually my college teacher, so we were very friendly afterwards. It's
Okay.
okay. But he said to me, he's like, Ruchie, in life you make mistakes. He said, just try not to make the same mistake twice.
It's interesting you say that because he told me, you're going to make mistakes. I also make mistakes. Try not to make the same mistakes I made. He said, make your own. Make new ones. I'll learn from mine. But I was also suspended. I was actually learning in a
I told
yeshiva.
you we were not
It's a
easy
Twerski.
kids.
I think it's a
learning-
Twerski thing.
I was learning, it could be. I was learning in a yeshiva in New York, and a couple of my friends got together at night. And this is in 10th grade, and they went down to the laundry room and they were drinking beer and whatever else was going on over there, like alcohol. And someone went and snitched on us, and we got caught. So they sent us home for Shabbos, and they said we couldn't come back. The whole yeshiva was coming back on Sunday. We couldn't come back to like Monday or Tuesday. And the only way we come back is if our parents, and in this way, my grandfather was the one in charge of my chinuch, that only if he would call the yeshiva to get me back in. So I wasn't going to hide this from him. So before I came home, I let him know about it. And then I came home. He did not say a word to me about it the entire Shabbos. Everything was just like, happy-go-lucky.
Normal.
On Sunday, I was starting to get a little nervous. I'm like, Zaydi, I have to go back to yeshiva. Oh, I have to call? Okay. And then that was it. He basically told me, don't get into trouble again and move on. He was so not fazed by the whole thing.
But the fact that I was suspended from high school, that was the only sentence I ever heard from him. I didn't hear anything. He didn't even ask me why. I didn't hear.
I feel stupid now. I asked you why, and I'm not even like.
No, he didn't even discuss it with me. It wasn't there wasn't a discussion. I was obviously in his mind mature enough to know what I did wrong and why I was sent home. And it wasn't, and this was throughout all of our chinuch, he never, ever gave us musar. He would tell us to read sometimes certain things. He would tell us to read Koheles or Pirkei Avos or things like that. But he never connected it to something specific that we did. He never told us, oh, you did this and this, and you can't do this and this, because he trusted that we understood exactly what we could and couldn't do. And he had complete faith in us.
He had faith in humanity, but he didn't give Musar, but he would always tell us stories. And he almost never told a story that didn't have a point. He has a book called Not Just Stories, and he wrote that to teach the lessons of the story. He lived at the stories of the Rebbes and the Gedolim from previous generations, but he told me once in a while, he would tell me stories. He would say, this is like of a story of a miracle that came about from a bracha of one of his grandparents or something. He would say, this is just so that history should have it, but I usually tell stories with lessons, and his musar would come with a story. The message he said with a story, or he'd say Dvar Torah, and it would come you wouldn't even realize he's telling you something about it till later.
Could you? I mean, I'm sure he told you thousands of stories. Could you share maybe one of? I mean, he probably had a lot of favorite stories, but one of his favorite stories, or one of the stories he shared with you that resonated more
the one
than the rest.
It's interesting. Which one?
You could each say one. If you each have one, you could say more than one.
You said that just stuck with you. You told it to me last week. That like stuck with you for
One of his favorite stories to tell about growing up in his house. You know, it was 1930 when he was born. He went to elementary school, you know, in the 1930s and the 1940s. Once they had a Rav that came for Rosh Hashanah to the house, you know, for Rosh Hashanah, and stayed over with them. And the rabbi who was there told, you know, he was also a chess. He was a very good chess player. And at 9, he was really an excellent chess player. So at 9 years old, the rabbi says to him, "It's Rosh Hashanah, let's go play a couple of games of chess." So he says, "Am I allowed?" He says, "Yeah." The rabbi says, "You're allowed." Okay. So after Yantif was over, you know, in those days, you know, you didn't walk into your father's library and say, "Hey, Dad, what's up?" Right? You actually stood by the door and waited to be recognized. So the Gabba told him that his father wanted to see him, and he says and go to the library. So he goes to the library, and the rabbi says, you know, his father says to him, "You played chess?" He says, so he said, "The rabbi told me it was okay," right? He says, "It's Rosh Hashanah," right? So he understood exactly what his father was saying, right? To him, right, it may have been permissible, but it wasn't what the day was all about, was playing chess. But he wouldn't let him go, right? You had to be dismissed also, right? And before he dismissed him, he asked him, "So did you beat him?" He says, 2 games. You understand? So even when you understand, so you have to understand that this is what his psyche was, how he grew up. He grew up in a place where the natural psychology and the natural being bawled out was not really natural for us, right? Because none of us get bawled out like that. None of us walk out of the room, you know, feeling good about ourselves, you know, when we get bawled out. Usually, I don't know.
We did.
His father would never tell them they did something wrong. He would say, "It's pasnish. It's not befitting for you to do it." It's interesting, by the way. He spoke to his father in third person, and as I was growing up, I once said to him, "Zayda, can I talk to you in third person?" And he said, "No way." He wouldn't let me do that. I mean, to the point, I remember as a bacher in yeshiva, I decided I'm not going to open up bottles on Shabbos anymore. You know, there's a big machlokes in the place. And my grandfather learned by his uncle, the Baba Virov, was his mother's younger brother. And the Baba, they opened up bottles. So that's what he did. I come back from yeshiva all front, and I'm not opening bottles anymore. I had no idea why, but, you know, I was being the frum guy. And I was with my grandfather for Pesach, just me, him, and Bobby. She should be well. And it was in here in Eretz Yisrael. And over Yantiv, he must have opened up bottles for me like 10 times. And I felt really uncomfortable. So I finally said, "Zayda, I'm being mountain netted. This is ridiculous. I mean, you're my grandfather, you're in your 70s, opening up bottles for me." And he looked at me and he said, "If I thought you should be mountain netted, I would have told you. Just keep on going." But he had that about him. But you asked one story. I think everything's basharet. So one story came to mind. I'll try to keep it short. My grandfather's great-grandfather was who he called the Zayda Ramatala, Ramatala Stipler, who was really larger than life. He was one of the Gateway Adar. He had thousands of chassidim. He was one of the most famous rebbes in his time. He died in 1903. So my grandfather never knew him, right? My grandfather writes about him. He has a book about him called the Zayda Ramatala. I would suggest you read it. And he talks about how the Zayda Ramatala was so real to him through his father, his grandfather, people who knew him, but he never knew him. I asked my grandfather once, I said, "Zayda, why did you remain from in the 1930s and 40s? Nobody was from then." And he looked at me, he pointed to the picture of his great-grandfather, he said, "He took away my freedom of choice. He took away my bechira." And he lived with that. And the story goes that when Ramatala passed away, when he was nifta, and my grandfather said this story many times, And there's a point to the story. That's why I'm saying it. And he lived with this. Their mother passed away, so they built the oil. They built this little, it's like a little hut around his kever. And there's only two places on each side of the oil who's going to get to be buried next to the Rebbe. He had a really old Gabbai that passed away shortly afterwards. They buried him on one side, and now there was only the other side. And there erupted a bit of a fight in Honesteipel, in the city where he was Rebbe, who's getting the place. He had a Gabbai Rabbi that was his trusted attendant Gabbai for many years, and he said, I want it. And the Rav of the city, Rabbi Yankel, said, no, I want it. I'm the Rav of the city. And so they had this fight, and they came to his successor, Rabbi Leibelo, who's my grandfather's grandfather, who we knew very well. And he asked them, they said, you have to solve this fight. And Rabbi Leibelo said, you know what? Whoever passes away first, he gets the place. And whenever any one of the two wasn't well or would get ill, the other one would go get everybody to say, tell him for him, he shouldn't die before him because he wants the place. And it's like the story ends up very nice. So the government had to move out of Honesteipel. So he was in Kiev. And it was one Thursday, he tells his children, we're going to Honesteipel for Shabbos. And his children said, like, Tata, you can't go. It was snowing and then it's illegal for you to go. You get in trouble. And he said, we're going to Honesteipel for Shabbos. And he went for Shabbos. And Reb Dun even came in to give him Shalom Aleichem before Shabbos. And sometime over Shabbos, Reb Dun passed away. And Matzah Shabbos, Reb Leibelo was there to make sure that Yankel the Rav wouldn't pull, move a little bit over when they buried him or whatever it was. And he got buried next to the Matala. But my grandfather brought out this point so many times. Look what was important to them. They weren't even worried about living. They wanted to make sure when they died, they'd be next to the Rebbe. He said, we go through life and we're busy with so many things, our luxuries and our cars and our salaries and all this stuff. He said, these people lived on a higher level. And that was the message he tried to give over. And he tried to live that way.
He definitely lived that way. We can talk a lot about it, and I really feel it's important to talk about his personality, but there's something that really stood out to me. Something that really stood out to me as a kid. My grandfather worked 12-hour days, even at the age when he could have, already started not retiring, but, taking off hours. He worked 12-hour days, and I don't ever remember him not learning, except for 15, 20 minutes when he was eating supper and 10 minutes on Matzah Shabbos when he read the cartoon section of the weekly paper. That was the only part of the paper that he read.
Which I had a question on
the
that
cartoons.
after you finish.
Yeah, we'll get there.
When he was always learning. He was either learning with us as kids, and me as a girl, I wasn't, he didn't leave me out of the learning. He learned with my brothers in the morning before shul and in the evenings after shul and on Shabbos afternoons. And I had to learn with him, and I had to learn with him Shabbos afternoon. And we had to come home from our friends' houses in the middle of the afternoon to learn. And then we could go back, but we always had to come home to learn with Zeta. I never, ever saw him without a sefer, ever.
Well, you never saw him ever not doing anything. He was
Right.
either learning,
he was always busy,
writing, sitting with somebody, talking on the phone. He never did anything. He was an extreme masmid. Like, he was always busy. Not in a pressured way, but he was always busy.
He never wasted a second.
Did he
never wasted a second?
like? Do you ever see him, or do you think he ever?
A little
like,
louder.
do you hear me?
Yeah, it's
do you think, or did you ever see him like this, or maybe felt that he felt this way? He's probably looked at as someone who perfected himself in a way. Was there ever like a pressure that he felt that people think he needs to be perfect and that he's not human and that everything is perfect, or he didn't have that pressure?
He was so humble. First of all, he always tried to perfect himself. And I think he expected perfection, but from himself. But I don't think it ever made a difference to him how other people saw him.
In the program, there are 12 steps. The fourth step is to take an inventory of oneself. You understand? So when you take an inventory, you take an inventory of all the goods that are no good, right? You take your character defects and write them down. You also take your character attributes and write them down. And for somebody, who is around the program all the time, and somebody who was around Musa, because he said that the entire program was stolen by this guy Bill Wilson, who wrote the 12 Steps in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous, and he shows you how to work them. But he was a person that worked Musa all the time, and was very much. He wrote a book on how to take the 12 steps and apply them into your life. And when you're constantly taking inventory, right, and you're constantly trying to increase your relationship with the God of your understanding. For me, it's Hashem today, maybe for other people as well. The spiritual side of the program is very great, and that in itself is something that leads to a change in one's lifetime, in one's life, because you have if you're looking at something square, and believe me, you don't get to this place very easily. There has to be, sometimes you have to go down a very long, you have to take the elevator ride down, he would say, to take the elevator ride back up again. And wherever you can stop the elevator going down anytime you want, right? But where does an addict do that? And that's not something that comes without a great deal of pain usually. Okay, I hope that answered the question a little bit.
I do want to just say one thing. He wasn't perfect. I'm going to tell this to you as his grandson. And I'm not embarrassed to say it because he'd be proud of me for saying it. He was very human. He was an amazing human being, but he made mistakes. And he actually taught me a great lesson, that even very great people sometimes make mistakes, but he would always tell me, learn how to admit your mistakes. He said, whether you make mistakes or not, that's not the issue. If you can't admit them, then you're in big trouble. And he always owned up to whatever people called him out on. I know I don't want to get into the details, but I know of a certain thing that people were bothered by. And I know somebody who wrote him an anonymous letter about it. And he was later on in his years. And he made a significant change in his life, in his own private life as a result of it. He was, he lived by that, but he was not perfect. And he did not expect you to be perfect. He expected you to try.
Right.
He, the Ezu Chama, what made me call Adam, I remember one of my significant childhood memories that repeated itself almost all the time was the fact that my grandfather used to attend AA meetings. And as a young teenager, I asked him if he was an alcoholic. And he told me no. So I asked him, and we knew that he went to AA meetings because he would say, okay, I'm going to a meeting. And then he'd come home from a meeting and he would always have what to say about this person got up and said this, amazing, this amazing insight into self-recovery, or an amazing concept in bettering yourself, or just so, or even faith. I mean, the stories of Emunah that he took from the AA meetings, and we would hear them all the time. And I remember asking him if he was an alcoholic, and he said no. And I said to him, so why do you go to AA meetings? And he told me, because it's not about being an alcoholic. It's about wanting to be a better person. And he had absolutely no embarrassment at all to use the tools that he was exposed to from people who, not everybody would want to listen to what they have to say, but in an AA meeting, you're quiet and everybody has their turn to talk, and everybody gets up and anonymously says, where they're holding and what they're doing. And no one's better than the other. All people are created equal there. And he really took every single thing that he heard there and he implemented it into his life when he was in his 80s also. Wow. Not just when he was, 40 and 50.
He recently opened up, in the last 10 years, he opened up a Frum 12-step meeting program in Beit Shemesh. He wasn't stopping. That's what his Rabbi Danny Myers, who's his son-in-law, and yeah, he was constantly working on himself, and he wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't afraid.
So I saw this, I think it was yesterday. So I think it's a Shkacha protest. I think it's famous, but I didn't know about this. I forgot the name of the cartoonist, Charles. He wrote
Charles
Charles
Schultz.
Schultz, Peanuts.
Charles Schultz. He wrote Peanuts, and I don't know exactly what it is, but he said a quote about your grandfather. Could you enlighten us about that? Do you know which quote I'm referring to?
I don't know if I know the exact words, but he did say my grandfather reached out to him because he would use this in his therapy when he was trying to help people to bring out the messages. He would hang up, I think he would hang up on the bulletin board.
Cartoons.
He would hang up these cartoons, and he met with Schultz, and Schultz told him that if I would feel and realize what you see in my cartoons, I'd freeze and I wouldn't be able to write them. So he appreciated my grandfather took it and took what this talent that he was putting out there, these feelings and inferiority feelings, self-esteem, all sorts of really interesting stuff, denial, like there's all sorts of good stuff there, and actually brought out the messages and used it to help people.
So we want to end soon because we know that we could literally sit here for 7 days straight. Well, not on Shabbos, and just talk about your grandfather and still have years to go. But I would want to finish off with this idea, and hopefully, you three could expound on it. Rabbi Dr. Twerski was maybe the best at taking Yiddishkeit and following Yiddishkeit and going with Yiddishkeit, but also at the same side, just be so involved in the secular world and have such a big impact on non-Jews. And he was you Hasidish. He's like super, very Hasidish, and he was able to blend the world so well. And that seemed like his life. Like how was he able to do that so well?
It's a balancing act.
I do want to, yeah, what were you saying, Rabbi?
No, it's a balancing act. How did he?
I do want to say two things that I've heard very recently, but it's things that we saw with him. When he went to school, okay, there's a fellow in Vancouver, should be about my grandfather's age, that was in university together with him. And he said whenever they were learning evolution, Darwinism, right? And whenever they would talk about it in class, and my grandfather was bright, and so he would speak up, he would say, Charles Darwin, whose theory I oppose and disagree with, and then he would go on to finish explaining it. But he learned it, but he maintained his distance and knew who he was. And another thing that happened when he was at the same time in university, he was kind of kept himself, he was very cordial, but he did not become friends with the people there. He tried to remain in his own little bubble. And there was a woman came over to him once. He said, Rabbi, why aren't you more friendly with us? And he's like, thanks, I intend to keep it that way. And meaning he was trying to keep his distance. Now, as he went out into the world, he treated people, so it was much, much different. But my grandfather, as I told you, he lived with his great-grandfather. He lived with his grandfather, with his father. That's what he saw in front of his eyes. If you would have sat with him at a Shabbos Suda, as Judah said before, you were like sitting at a tish of a Rebbe from 150 years ago, to watch him cry his way through the Severas. If you watched him daven the ailyah on Yom Kippur for the Almond, I had the opportunity to be with him the last 9 years in Bet Shemesh and his son-in-law Shul. He picked everybody up. You were in a different world. And at the same time, he could crack that joke, and he was just so real. And then it was to the cartoons, but his head and his mind never left the Torah, never left his father's home, but at the same time, used the tools that he was able to pull in from the outside world. I saw somebody say about him that he kept the Messiah, but he always knew what was allowed to be brought into the Messiah to help things move along for the generation that he was in.
I think that one of the most amazing things about him really was his ability to blend the two things, his love and his acceptance of everything around him in the world, and his Torah and spirituality and his emunah. There were things that we didn't see, that we actually didn't even know growing up, because he never put on a show. Friday night Kiddush was one of those moments that we felt like we were literally in a different world. And I felt like this from when I was 4 years old till 42
Before
now.
we knew he was famous.
Before we knew he was famous. And I felt like this as a kid, and I kept the same feeling as I grew up. And I thought, okay, maybe it's nostalgia because that's what I grew up with. But when I got married, and I married, a person who comes from also a very rich background, and my husband has a little bit of a more cynical side. But the first time he saw my grandfather make Kiddush, he was just like, this is out of this world. That this isn't something that's in this world. And it was a side of him that we didn't get to see often, but Friday Night Kiddush was one of them. My 20-year-old son was zeichet to see this by Hanukkah Licht by accident when we were all there for Hanukkah Licht, and everybody went, and he was in a back room, and he didn't know that we all left, and he came out 15 minutes later, and he found my grandfather standing by the Hanukkah Licht and crying and singing, and he stood behind him for like 15 minutes just to watch him because he'd never seen him like that. Then he came home and told us about it. And when we spoke to Bubby about it, she's like, well, yeah, that's all the time when people aren't here. He was a very multifaceted person. And at the same time, he was able to play the same son when he was 11 years old. My grandfather came to visit us, and we were passing by my son's school, and the school was open. And my grandfather had been a good ping pong player when he was little. And my son was the best ping pong player in the school when he was 11. And so my grandfather said to him, hey, Mordechai, let's go play a game of ping pong. And so they did. And my grandfather won at the age of 79. He won my champion 11-year-old. And I'm, for one, I'm so grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that my children were able to see this unbelievable, multifaceted personality that, most people don't get to see. I felt like he was a direct conduit of his grandfathers before him, and the chinuch that he felt was such a real part of his life, he was able to give that over to us. And we felt like we were growing up with these Rebbes over our shoulders, with the Zeder of Matalan, the Zeder of Label, and all the people who he held so esteemed and so dear.
It did take me till about age 28 till I realized I wasn't going to be the Gadol Hador. It took some time, I'm serious. But whatever. Do we have time for a story, or we're out of time?
No, go for it.
I wanted to talk a little bit about.
He has to say something.
You were asking, if you looked at him, right? So he had the tzura, right? His face looked like a Hasidic Rebbe. And when you looked at him stand in front of an audience, right, you didn't believe that the words that were coming out of his mouth, the same way when you read his books, you don't believe that those words are like, coming out, that he's expressing himself in an Oxford English, right, with an education of a professor, because he was a professor in Pittsburgh Medical School. He wasn't, he was a professor. His language was a professor language, So when he would walk into a room, there was a very big dichotomy that came about, right? He stood in front of the room, and then he opened his mouth, and then everybody, with their ears would listen up. I always remember the stories of the people who were addicts, who were taken into the mental hospital, right? After being drunk for 10 days or high for 10 days, right? And he was there, he would be at their bedside, and they would wake up, and they were Catholic, and they would look at him and said, oh my God, I guess we got this all wrong. And he said, you had a little too much to drink, or he would say you had too many perks. They had too many perks last night. And I can't tell you the amount of people that happened to. It's when I said before that he was the biggest Kiddush Hashem walking, he was. He really was.
And he was a Kiddush Hashem when he was younger in college also. That's what these people tell us. Do we have time for a story, or we're out of time?
Say the story, and then we have one closing thought. And
okay,
thank you.
I'm picking a story that I did not witness, but I think it shows who he was in his level of emunah. Many years ago, he developed a program for recovery for prisoners in Eretz Yisrael, and he had to personally fundraise for it. And as he told me, he said to me, Chaim, I was a terrible fundraiser. Anyway, he had to come up with like $50,000 by within a week. And he has a very good friend in Vancouver, Rabbi Fegelstock, who's married to a woman from Pittsburgh. They're very close, and he spent a lot of time there. So Rabbi Fegelstock had one of these philanthropists in his community, reached out, and he said, sure, he's willing to make a fundraiser, a meeting on Sunday. So my grandfather said, okay, he's coming for Shabbos. And Rabbi Fegelstock told over the story. He said, as my grandfather was on the plane, this philanthropist calls up and says, Rabbi Fegelstock, I'm going to have to cancel that event. I can't do it. So he comes down to the airport to pick up my grandfather, and my grandfather gets off the plane. He says to Rabbi Twerski, the guy canceled. There's still flights back to Pittsburgh. Do you want to go back to Pittsburgh tonight? And my grandfather said, no, I'm staying here. So he's like, well, I'm here for Shabbos. He's like, yeah, but he canceled the fundraiser and you need that money by Tuesday. He's like, oh, Baruch Hashem. So he looks at him, he's like, what do you mean Baruch Hashem? He told him, there's a famous story with the Maggid, when the Maggid had to fundraise to marry off an orphan, I think it was, or whatever it was. And he was trying to fundraise. And finally he asked the fellow in the city, give me the address of the wealthiest man in town, who was a big miser. And he gave him the address. And the guy said, he doesn't give out any money. He said, just give me the address. So the Maggid goes up. This is Rabbi is rich. He goes up to the miser, and the miser basically says, I'm not giving you any money. And he walks out of the house. He looks up to Rabbi and says, now I've done whatever I can do. Now it's all up to you. And my grandfather turned to Rabbi Fegelstock. He said, I've done whatever I can. It's not up to me anymore. And he stayed for Shabbos. And he did a whole Shabbos, and he said he was in a great mood and great spirits. He did the whole thing. Someday they had a get-together with a speech. It was not a fundraiser because the guy had canceled. And that fellow that had canceled was there in the audience. He walks up to my grandfather with tears in his eyes after his speech. And he says, can you come to my office tomorrow morning? My grandpa said, sure. My grandfather came to his office the next morning. The guy had a check for $50,000 made out to him.
Wow. That's amazing. The last thought I wanna say is, and Chaim, I'm pretty sure it was you, by your grandfather's levaya, you got up there and you said, you quoted him. He specifically asked that there's no hespedim. He had one request. Could you tell us a little about that? I didn't know your grandfather. I knew about him and read some of his books. But when I saw that, I'm like, that is classic Rabbi Dr. Twerski right there.
So it is, and I actually look at it, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but he did not mean it this way, but I found it to be like his last time letting the world know that he didn't care what anybody thought about him.
So true.
And he did whatever he wanted.
And he did it well.
He told so many of his children and his grandchildren, and he reminded me literally more than 100 times, my levaya, and he would tell me no espedim. And he explained it to me, and he explained it to several other people. There's a clip going around. He explained it to Rabbi Yaakov from Guard Your Eyes has a clip when he explained it. He said, this is going to be his ticket or his key to Gan Eden. He said, because it belonged to me. God gave me that gift. He said,
for those who don't know, he wrote that song.
Correct. He composed it at the Shabbos Oifef of his brother, Rav Michal, the Rebbe in Milwaukee, his younger brother, 60 or 61 years ago. And he sang it at the wedding and at the next brother's wedding. And it went all over the world, came back to Lubavitch, and it became very famous. And he felt that this was a gift Rebbe Shalom gave him. And through this gift, he had been misamech so many people. He felt that, this would be his schus to get into Gan Eden. But in classic Maizeda style, he backed it up with a story. And he built it. He got the idea from Rav Moshe Leib Sassover, who had married off 2 orphans that he had raised and raised the money to marry them off. And at the chasna, he was in ecstatic joy and simcha, and he was dancing for hours to a certain tune. And he mentioned in the middle of this whole thing, I wish that this would be the tune, the niggin that would accompany me to the next world with this mitzvah. And years later, this band, this klezmer, they were heading to a wedding of brother or something like that. And the horses went wild. He writes a story in one of his books. It's not just stories. And the horses went wild, and they ended up running wild until they reached the cemetery, and they see a funeral going on. And they asked, whose funeral is this? They said, it's Rav Moshe Leib Sassover's. And one of the old members of the band, he remembered, oh, wow, that was the one. He said we should play the song at his levaya. So they started playing this tune, and they escorted him with that. I think that's where my grandfather got the idea from. But he felt that this was going to let him in. He didn't think there were any other tickets to let him into Gan Eden.
There's nothing else, just the song. Oh, gosh.
He said that he told me when I was 17 was the first time that he told me that he wanted this played at his levaya. And that when I get married, I should tell my husband to make sure that this is what they play at his levaya. and when I asked him, but why? So he said, I want to go to Gan Eden with this song because there's not a Jew, there's not a frum Jew in the world who doesn't know this song. If you become frum, you learn Hayshia Samecha. Maybe first you learn Hava Nagila, but then you learn Hayshia Samecha. We count with Hayshia Samecha. We sing Hayshia Samecha at every simcha. It's saying it every pish. It's saying it every simchas Beis HaShoeva and every simchas Tyron. You look, no matter what yarmulkes people are wearing, it's saying in YU and it's saying in Merkaz Harav and it's saying in the Great Synagogue and a million other. And every Jew that you see, every from Jew that you see, whatever kind of from they are, they sing Hayshia Samecha, and that's what he wanted. That's what he wanted to go up with, and he did.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, you three, for spending the time with us. This has been incredible, and we couldn't get the opportunity to get to sit down with your grandfather, but he left so much for all of us to learn from him. His impact is huge, is not even the right word, and
it's legendary.
Legendary.
It's legendary.
But his main impact is that we can all make ourselves into better people, and you don't go to heaven for being talented, but you go to Gan Eden for using your talents. And on this world, you impact the world, and we all have talents. And we just have to work on ourselves and use them, share them with the world, whatever they may be, all of us. That's what he was. That's what he wants. That's what he would have wanted from us now.
Beautiful.
Wow, he finally released it.
Yeah.
It's been waiting to get out there to the world, and
Crazy.
So I'm still sad we weren't able to get Rabbi Doctor himself, but we got to have, I guess the fruits of his labor, his children and someone who's gotten help from him. And where our tribute's not ending here, this has been part 1, and we probably could do 50 parts. But
we won't.
Yeah, we won't. I mean, just look through all his books; it's incredible. But part 2, you're gonna hear Rabbi Twerski's son. He has a few children, but we got his son, who's actually been pretty private about his life, and he doesn't really do this very often, but
we actually able to come here and sit down, and we had an amazing conversation with his son about the life of his father, growing up in the home of his father. So stay tuned for that episode coming out next week, and of course remember to leave us a review, to give us 5 stars, not less than 5 stars, 5 stars, because we deserve it.
Please.
Thank
you. Someone, my friend Mayor, gave an idea, and I'm probably butchering the line. I don't remember what he said. It's like something along the lines like, everyone is filled with meaningfulness.
Nope.
Yeah, but he said it better than me.
There was somebody also that came over to me at a bar mitzvah last week. This kid in South Shore, he wanted a shout out. His last name is Kaplan. Don't remember his first name.
How much money did he give us?
Nothing.
Oh my gosh.
Mr. Kaplan.
There you go.
And Mr. Antonelli. Here's your shout out. Enjoy.
Say ciao.
Ciao, ciao, ciao. Bum, bum, bum.